Hey everyone, it's Ethan here from Extreme RC 4x4, and today we're going to be doing some maintenance on the TRX-4. I'm going to be greasing the front axle of this truck. I've already done the rear axle a while ago actually, and I was going to do the front on film, but I never really got to it until now. So we're going to do only the front axle on film because it is more complicated because of the steering. So you should be able to get the rear axle okay. And a few reasons you might want to do this is this really helps keep the water out of your axles depending on the grease you use. I like to use a marine grease. That's worked well for me in the past, and it also helps decrease wear and tear on parts if you have them greased and well lubricated. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. Pop the body off. And we can go ahead and we're going to start by removing this shift linkage here. This is the front axle one up here, and you really don't need to worry about this. This shouldn't scare anybody away. All you have to do is let's see here, just going to pop that out, and then right here you can see there's this piece on this cable here, the shroud, like fits in here, so you don't have to worry about getting it out of adjustment. It just clamps in there. And whenever I'm doing something like this, I like to put the hardware back where it came from so that I don't lose things in the process. So now we can go ahead. I've already went around and loosened everything really that we're gonna have to get at to remove this so that it's quick and not painful to watch. So we can start by removing both tires. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and remove this steering link here. I like to remove it on the axle so that we don't have to mess with the servo. And replacing the hardware again. Now we can go ahead and remove this panhard bar. I like to use the ball socket for this one. So this just screws in right down here. And we can pull that out. When I'm doing this, I like to try to keep as much of the links themselves just on the truck. That way you don't have to deal with taking it off of the axle when you're going to grease it. And now we can go ahead and start removing our links. We have one on both sides, and then we have the top link that we need to get at. So we'll just leave that there for now. And then there's also this one top link right here that we're gonna have to get at. And before we completely remove this, just want to take a look at how your differential lock cable is ran, and then we can go ahead and disconnect it from the truck. Oh, We still have to pull the drive shaft off. Alright, so now that we got the axle off, we're going to be covering this in a few different parts. First, we have these portal boxes here, which give you some lower gearing and higher clearance, as you can see. And then after that, we're going to cover the actual axle itself. So really what we're going to do is just strip the axle kind of its components. I'm going to start on this side, removing this portal box. Actually, we should replace this hardware that I pulled off a second ago. So when you get these screws out for your steering knuckles here, make sure you keep that little collar piece on. Serves as kind of a bushing for the steering. So once you have this out, you can pull the whole axle shaft out. And let's go ahead and look at this. I've been driving this for probably a couple months like this. You can see how dry this actual shaft is, and the dirt has started to work its way from the outside to the inside. So we're going to try to prevent that and also clean that out. You can see kind of where the seal was up here, and all the dirt is kind of slowly working its way in. So one thing I would recommend is just finding a way or a place to put your parts. I've found that even just a Tupperware lid here with some lips on it will actually keep your parts in pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish stripping the axle, and then I'll be right back. Alright guys, I've skipped ahead a little bit here and did one portal. I just wanted to make sure I knew what I was doing before I tried to present it to you guys. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to do both portals, and then we'll finish this and we'll put it all back together. So starting with this one, we're going to grab our electric screwdriver here. That makes the job a whole lot easier. So there's 6 screws on the back we got to take off, and 2 on the front, and then we can pull this apart and dig deeper into it. Alright, so we got all those out. Go ahead and pull this apart, and this is what it comes with factory. It looks like maybe a very thin grease or an oil kind of has been in here. So it's really not that great of protection from wear and tear, as well as water and things like that. So on the back here we have this big bearing and this shaft here. I think they call these XVDs. These are actually usually offered as an upgrade part for trucks, but they come standard on the Traxxas. Usually they're like a dog bone style, and these help with your steering angle and doesn't give you that jumping when you're at extreme angles. So I like to clean out the screw heads because these are incredibly tiny screws, and then we can go ahead and remove them. And I like to do these by hand and not with a drill or anything, just because of how tiny they are. So to give you a better idea, this is what the screw looks like, really tiny. So make sure you don't lose those. And now we can pull this whole part through the back side here. And then we can separate the bearing from the gear here. Actually slides off the back, thought it went the other way. And then after that we can push through this pin right here and pull it out, and then we can pull the shaft apart so that we can clean everything, get all the grime out. And on this lower part with the gear still left in it, we're just gonna take that hex off down here. And while I have it off, this is something that Traxxas did here. They have this kind of edge before it gets to the threads. Usually these shafts don't have that on them. So Traxxas kind of did that, and a lot of the aftermarket wheels don't work perfectly with these TRX-4s just because of that. Kind of keeps you having to buy Traxxas stuff, I guess. Maybe that's what their idea was. They would make their money off of that, but I'm not exactly sure. So we can also pull that apart and separate all of this. And now I'm going to go ahead and wipe all this down. You guys probably don't want to watch that, so I'll just cut that out. Alright guys, I've got it wiped down for the most part, or at least as thoroughly as I'm going to go. I didn't really wipe a lot of the grease out of the inside of these guys here because there's really nothing there, and you don't have to worry about the dirt and the grime on the outside of these parts as long as you don't get it on the inside. So this is the grease I'm using, just generally marine grease. It's green and I'm almost out of it. So I like to go around and coat everything with the grease here, and not just the gears. And then another thing I like to do that I don't see a lot of people doing is kind of creating a seal or a gasket of grease almost. It's not the exact definition of those, but I like to put a layer of this grease on the outside here, in between where the plastics clamp together, and I think that really helps make up for the tolerances in the plastic. And when I put this together, you'll see it squeeze out, but I think it fills the gaps a little bit better and gives you a nice tight seal. And then on the outside here, just put a layer of it around here. We can clean it up a bit later. And then this half we can go ahead and do. And I'll also put a thin layer of grease on this half around the outside here. And then on this back side here where the bearing goes, I'll also put a little bit in there. Really what you're trying to do with this grease is just create a seal to keep everything out of the things that you're trying to keep out of the elements. That's why they have these big cases around them and not just the bare gears. And the first thing I like to do is this top gear here. I like to grease that up, and then that way we can start putting the shaft together again. And then we can go back and grease this a little bit more on the gear part once we get it back together. Just slide that bearing on here. Actually, we gotta put the shaft on first. So just coat the end here. And then this little piece we're gonna put back in with the hole through the center of it. And that just goes in. Make sure you can see the hole when you put it back through. Then we're gonna hold it where we can see through that hole, and then find the hole on this one and put it together like that, and then find one of these little pins and put it through, and then just try to find your spot here and push it through. Now we can go ahead and put that bearing on to hold the pin in. Some grease over that. And then through the back side here, we can go ahead and pop this in. I'm not going to put any of those screws in quite yet. Some more grease on that gear. Now we can go ahead and grease this gear on the bottom for our output shaft. And then a little bit around this output shaft itself. And then we need to put the pin through this side over here, and then put it onto the gear. And then we can go ahead and put it through the other half of the case. And then to retain that, we can put on the hex again. Sometimes takes a little bit of finesse, and we can go ahead and put this back in. And I can see that they must have had some kind of Loctite on this, but I'm not going to re-Loctite it. I don't think it's all that necessary. Seems how the wheel is going to be holding it on. Now we can go ahead and put the halves back together here, making sure that everything lines up. And now we can go ahead and start putting some screws back in. I like to do these outside ones on the bottom first. Just start them by hand, and then we can go ahead and drill them in almost the rest of the way. And when we sealed that up, you can see the grease coming out of where they meet together, or where they would seal, you could say. So that's a good sign. That means that we got grease in there, and that it's going to be sealing it better than just the plastic. Now we can go ahead and put in the little tiny screws. Now we can go ahead and tighten these down, that we have them in loose. And you don't want to go too tight with these either, because they're tiny and it's just plastic. make sure everything moves. Now it is okay to feel a little bit of resistance. That's part of greasing it. You're going to get some resistance. I'm back. It's the next day. As we did last night, or in the last part of the video, we got our portals done. So now we're going to move on to the main axle here itself. Now we're going to be covering a few things here. There's areas that you want more grease than others, and especially around this where the differential lock is, we want to be really careful about how much grease we're using there and inside the actual open differential itself. So we can start by just taking it all apart. I'm gonna take these ends off first. There's 3 screws right here, and we can take the knuckles off, or the C-hubs, I'm not sure. And now in here, we're going to be trying to seal this up when we're putting it all back together, just because this is probably where majority of the dirt gets in. You can actually see it inside of there. Now we can go ahead and take the differential cover off with these 4 screws here on the back. And we're not going to worry about removing the link mounts right now. Alright, so now we can go ahead and pop this differential cover off here. And as you can see, really not a whole lot of grease in here. So now our cable here, to get these parts out, we're going to have to pull this E-clip on the outside off. I like to use just a little flathead screwdriver. Get in there and pull it right off. Now this piece will push through the axle. We're not going to completely remove it, but we're going to pull this collar off, or the shift dog. I don't know exactly what the technical term is, but we're going to pull this piece off. And as you can see, this cable has a bend in it, so if we turn this way, we can just slide it right out, just like this. On, off. And then I like to just leave the cable in the axle like this. There's no reason to really completely remove it. Now we can pull the main gear and the differential, as well as the locking mechanism, off with the bearings. And then our drive gear here comes out. And then we'll just leave those bearings in. So clean out any dirt or grime that you can see in here as best as you can. A tip for these the axle tubes here is twist your rag up and put it inside here. Alright, now we can go ahead and we're going to do this differential first. There's a little bit of dirt on this. I did not clean it off. So that just goes to show how much actually gets in there if it makes it all the way up to the differential. So the grease should help keep this out of our parts. We can go ahead and clean our bearings off. And then this piece just came off. This is part of the locking mechanism. It runs with this pin here, and it rides like this. This would be open. and then it locks the differential like this. That's a locked differential. So open and then locked. So in case anybody was wondering how the differential lock works, that's how it works. It just basically locks this piece. I just dropped the pin, but it locks this axle shaft onto the rest of the differential, or the spool here, or it kind of makes it a spool, and then this axle shaft on this side cannot move separate because there's not that plane anymore. It just locks it up. And now we have a big bearing on the outside here. And then we're going to remove the gear from this differential here. Alright, so now we can go ahead, pull this apart here, and here's your differential. And we can just pop this gear out of here. And then these gears inside, we can go ahead and pull out. So you get these two on this shaft here. Notice the shafts have this cutout segment in the middle here. That's so that they can mesh together properly. And then we can push out the other axle shaft that was in there. And again, just wipe everything down. Now this housing itself is plastic, and it seems to be holding up just fine from because the locker hooks on right there, and the differential inside, everything looks to be just fine. Now we can apply a thin coat in here. All the grease in here is going to be thin. We're not going to go as thick as we went on the portals or anything else for that matter, because if you do put too much grease in here, it's not going to act like an open differential. When it's open, it's going to be really stiff, and you don't want that. Actually, the first time I rebuilt the rear axle, I put too much grease in, and it was just really stiff. It didn't seem like it was locking or unlocking. So just take that into consideration. And again, just a little seal kind of deal going on here. And the first one we're going to put back in is this the longer shaft with the gear on it here. This goes out to the side with the locking mechanism, and we want to grease this shaft because there is no bearing in there. It's all just direct contact. And thin coat, because this is one of the gears inside of the differential. Want a pretty thin coat. That might be a little bit thicker than I want it to go, but so we can go ahead and put this longer one in. Make sure it spins freely. Now we can take one of our shafts that goes on the inside and grease that up just a bit there. And then just going to put a little bit of grease on each of these gears. It'll work its way around. Now make sure that we have this, the cutout here. We want to make sure that if we're holding this up, that cutout is up, and it doesn't matter which way you put it in. as long as the that cutout is up. So now we're going to do the same thing with this other shaft and the other two gears. And now this one, we want to make sure that our cutout is down because the other one is up, so these shafts have to come together. They would basically be crossing in the exact same spot if those cutouts weren't there. So we're just going to push it in, make sure everything's seating in there good, and now put some around the edge here. Then we have this short output shaft here. Put a little bit of grease on that. And again, on this part here, where it's going to be actually rubbing on the other gear, on this gear here, they're actually in direct contact, there's no bearing. So we can go ahead and place this back in here, spin it around, and you can see these teeth here, they actually hold the differential from spinning on this. And we can put just a little bit of grease on that, and then line these teeth up. They actually hold the differential gears in there, it looks like. And as you can see, still acts as a open differential. It will try to push apart if you don't have it screwed together. So we can go ahead and put some of those screws back in and then move on. Alright, now we're going to start by right over here. We're going to put this big bearing back on. We want a just a thin coat, just like on the inside of the differential over this, because what can happen is if you get too much in here, all these little teeth where the locking mechanism comes together, it can create kind of a vacuum and it can hold this in here. Those little servos, they're really not all that strong because this shouldn't take a lot of force. So you don't want a lot in there, just because of the fact that it can create kind of that vacuum. And go ahead and play with it by hand, just make sure everything's working good. Then we can grease this shaft. And on this side over here, a little bit of grease around here for that bearing. We'll put the bearing back on. And we'll take the little shaft here and put it back in the hole through this shaft, and then our actual locking mechanism we can put on, play with it again a little bit, and then I like to put a little bit in this groove here of the mechanism, because the locking piece, or this guy here, actually rides in that while you're driving. So Now we can go ahead and throw our bearing back on. And the axle shaft has a lip on it so that this piece, or the bearing, cannot get pushed tight up against it and allows this to stay functioning here, so you can't push the bearing on too far. We'll put some grease around this bearing. And now the axle here itself, we'll start in the back side here in this bearing. And we can go ahead and put this gear in here. Put a little bit of grease around it. And then this side over here, where the locking mechanism goes, is where you really don't want that much grease, just because that piece has to stay functional, and if you cake it with grease, it's not going to be able to move. I like to try to push some down these the axle tubes here, just because the axle doesn't come apart into two halves. So we can go ahead and drop this guy in there. It goes in just like this. Move it around a little bit to spread that grease out. And then what I like to do is grease this big gear here. That gets a lot of wear. So the grease will eventually just work its way around while you're driving. So don't worry about that too much. And we can put a little bit on this piece here, just to create kind of a seal around there. And now make sure you got it oriented correctly. Let's see here. And then we're going to take this piece and put it on there. So you're going to want this angled to this direction, and then this will just go on there. If you turn it, you can see, and then you can rotate it as you wish now that you have it on. And then this pops into the plastic just like that, and then pull the axle shaft, or the locking, whatever you call this, the cable out. And we're just going to hand operate a little bit, make sure everything's working good. And as you can see, there's little force on that, so that'll be good for that little servo. And then we can put some more grease on this differential cover here. I'll just put some in by where this gear goes. And then over by this bearing here, because it holds the bearing on. And then we're going to go ahead and put some around the edge, again, to create kind of a seal. And we place it on there. And we can put the cover back on. I'll do that to drill. And I don't like to tighten things with the drill because you can't really feel the torque that's going into it. I just like to get it most of the way in, especially for this plastic stuff. It can be a lifesaver because you got to drive it so far in before it actually starts getting torqued down. And now that we got that done, before we forget, we should put the E-clip back onto the locking mechanism cable, so you can clean that off a little bit as best as you can. Take our E-clip. You wouldn't want to forget this. I don't think the mechanism would work correctly without it. And you need some pliers. See if they, yes. Alright. So there you go. Not a whole lot of force. You don't want to bend it. And you just want to make sure if it's not going in right, you might not have this out far enough so that this can go into the groove that's there for it. And then you're just going to make sure there's not play in it. Alright, now all we need to do is put some grease down the axle shafts. If I can get any more out of this can. And we want to put some grease in there and kind of help create that seal around these guys. That should be good for that one, definitely. On this guy, grease around the outside again. So I cut my finger open a little bit there. Sharp can. So now, I should probably go wash that out. Be right back. Alright, continuing on. Now we just gotta make sure there's no dirt on the inside of these. There's just a little bit. Gosh, kind of a tight spot. But just clean that out as best as you can. So those are good now. And you want to make sure you have the axle upright, so you can tell that by the panhard bar is up. And then we're going to make sure that these are dropping down farther. You can see the long side is on the bottom. And we can put in our screws here. And again, I'll use the drill. Another thing is, it'll tell you which side is which. As you can see, there's a little R right there, and this is the right side of it if you're looking at it from the front. So this would be the front of the truck right here that we're looking at. This would be the front, and this is the right side. So just another nice thing they put in for people who are working on these things. We got these all tightened down. Just gonna go ahead and put a little bit of grease in that hole around the surface. And then you want to make sure you know which side is which. This is the shorter shaft, so it goes onto the, whatever this says here, the right side. The shorter shaft is the right side. And we're just going to grease this axle shaft a little bit. And then in this joint, try to get more grease while we have it off. So that should definitely be good. And we can go ahead and put it in here. And we're going to try to keep as much of the grease inside of the axle as we can. And just wiggle it around until you feel it engage in there. You might have to turn your hexes a little bit. Now we can go ahead, throw our hardware in to attach it. And just making sure that we have our collars in there too. That would make your steering really loose if you lost one of those collars. Now you just want to check, make sure everything's tight. Move it around if you got all your steering. And then we're going to give it a thorough cleaning here. All of this excess grease that I've got on it. Alrighty, so we've got that done. So we can go ahead and grab the truck because we are done greasing it now. Pull some of our tools out of the way here. Make sure you don't have any parts left on the table. And if you do, make sure you know where they came from. I'm going to put on the top link here first. I think that's my best bet. And I'm actually going to put the steering link on last. Make sure you have the right link for it. And route your differential cable back up to the truck like it had been previously. I'm just going to loosely put everything together so you guys can get an idea here. The next thing I'm going to do is this the panhard bar. Probably looks like a big mess to you guys, which it kind of is at the moment. And then the last things we got to do as far as links here are attach these, the actual lower links and the shocks. And if you guys can remember, the lower links go inside of these pieces here. Oh boy, this is gonna be fun. So lower links go inside of those. And then our shock is going to go on the outside. Slide it through all that, and then we're just going to loosely put it on. Same thing goes for the other side. Now we have to do the steering links. And I'm going to start on the side where the servo attaches. I think that'll just be easier. So we'll put it through the link from the servo. And then this one, you want to make sure you have these rod ends correctly in here. And we slide that between the two pieces. Slide our screw in. now that we've got all that in, you can put your drive shaft on. So then we're gonna put the tires on, and as I was talking about, the TRX specific rims on these shafts here. Now that we've got all the tires and stuff on, we can go ahead and remove this screw here again. And we're going to place this rod end back onto the servo, snaps back on. And then we're going to put this cable back into position. And screw it back in. Now we can go ahead and check to make sure everything's working well. Turn the remote on and go ahead and plug this in. This is my long wiring harness for my winch. And then, right, so it's live. I'll actually go ahead and set this in here. Got all my foam to lock it down well when I'm actually driving it. Let's see, how do I do this here? It's been a while. And I'll grab some jack stands. Now that we got it on jack stands, test it, make sure everything works. So this is unlocked. Now, you might feel a little bit more resistance at first. This is just because of the fact that we have grease in there, and before there was no grease. So it's going to cause a little resistance, but over time the gears will work the grease through it and move it out of the way, so the resistance is not going to be this strong forever. Now, locking mechanism. This is front differential locked. Right here you can see it moving. So yep, that's engaging well. Rear differential still open. Lock that as well. And now we'll go ahead and unlock the rear, unlock the front. And just like that, everything still works. We can even shift it if we wanted to. Alright, so there you go, guys. That is how you grease the axles in your TRX-4. I only demonstrated the front axle because the rear axle is even more simpler, or even simpler once you know how to do the front. So thank you guys for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if this helped you guys out a little bit, and I'll see you guys in the next video.